Easter. Yeah. How's that feel to be on the journey and just right around the corner from your destination? It's a good feeling, isn't it? How many of you like being almost there? Because then you can answer that dreaded question, are we there yet? And you can say, just right around the corner. Almost. Not quite. And that's true today for Palm Sunday. We're blessed in that we know where the destination is. We know that this week we celebrate Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, where he will undergo the Last Supper, betrayal, crucifixion, burial, and then resurrection. But on that first Palm Sunday, they didn't know very much about any of that. They only knew that Jesus had decided to go to Jerusalem. Now, not everybody, including his disciples, were very excited about Jesus going to Jerusalem. They knew that it was not a safe place. They knew it wasn't a place that was going to welcome them with open arms. They knew it was a place where Jesus most likely was going to face certain death. And so they objected. You know how those disciples were. We'll learn some more about that in a bit. But we're almost there. We're getting ready for the last little bit. We're ready to go to Jerusalem. But let me ask you a question. What was that really like back in Jesus' day? Well, let me see if I can help you understand that just a little bit. A little over 2,000 years ago, Jesus and his disciples were getting ready to go into Jerusalem. It was Passover time. People were coming to Jerusalem by the thousands. It was the biggest, most celebrated religious holiday the Jews had. They were coming together to be reminded of God's great saving act while they were slaves in Egypt. They were coming together to be reminded that God had taken action and brought the people out of Egypt into the promised land and to the greatest of all time. Who was there? Josephus, one of the great early historians, reported that there would have been hundreds of thousands of people descending on Jerusalem at that time. There's records of one Jesus' contemporary time of 256,000 perfect lambs being slaughtered for Passover. That's a lot. And when you think about what that really means, the number of people that represents is astounding. For each lamb that was slaughtered signified a group of 10 people. 256,000 lambs sacrificed to the Lord our God. For those of you who are better mathematicians than I, let me just put it this way. It was a whole lot of folk. So who was there? Who was along that parade route as those thousands of people descended on Jerusalem? Well, I'm going to tell you that there were at least 4 different groups of people there. And maybe you'll find yourself in one of these groups. I'm going to tell you that the first group that becomes evident is the group of Roman soldiers. They were the easiest to pick out. They were in full dress uniform, armed to the teeth, charged with keeping the peace. Important because Passover was also a time when the rebel rousers within the Jewish world, the zealots, would oftentimes try to overthrow the Roman soldiers. And so they were on their guard. They were watching for anything that looked out of the ordinary. They were ready to defend Caesar at the drop of a hat. Time and time again, they had put down little outbursts around Jerusalem. They thought it was really a pain. They were there to keep the peace in a group of people that they didn't like, in a place they didn't like living. But on this day, something unusual happened that I think might have made the Roman soldiers smile or even just laugh out loud. For on that day, these soldiers saw Jesus riding into Jerusalem on the most magnificent animal they could find, a donkey. To make matters worse, it was a donkey that had never been ridden before. If you've never ridden a donkey, I invite you to find one and give it a try. To make matters worse, those thousands of people were picking up the palm fronds and waving it. We have a donkey on our farm where Sheila and I are living. When we first moved in, you couldn't even walk up to it and pet it, but we've got him tame now. He likes us. He loves it when we come up and rub the side of his neck or the top of his head, but only from the side. If we stand right in front of him, he turns his body and moves. If we move with him, he moves the other way. He thinks it's a game, I think. He doesn't like having his vision impaired. He wants to know his escape route. Because after all, if he sees us scratch him on the nose, he might have to admit that he likes it. But donkeys are funny that way. As Jesus is riding into town on the donkey, the guards, the Roman soldiers, hear the crowd shouting, "Hosanna to the new king!" And as soon as they heard that, they went on the defensive until they saw what was coming down the road. For after all, a king doesn't ride a donkey. A general doesn't ride a donkey. A colonel or even a lowly private in the Roman world wouldn't have ridden a donkey. He is no threat. But the crowd might be. Those Roman soldiers, they knew what a triumphal entry was supposed to look like. They had seen their generals ride in chariots pulled by those beautiful white horses. They had seen Caesar enter into Rome or whatever city he comes into on those big chariots with those lots of horses pulling. Now that is a parade. This is just a farce. The soldiers were there. The second group I would have called your attention to was the group we call the crowd. Now, there are lots of people in the crowd. There are always lots of people in the crowd, it seems. And people in the crowd, well, they really aren't followers. They're just spectators. They're there to see the show. They're there to see what miracle might happen at the hands of Jesus in the upcoming days. They've come out because they've heard the story about Lazarus, which is in John's part of the story, in John chapter 12. They've heard the story that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. Pretty cool trick, if you ask me. That's what the crowd was saying. They had heard about Jesus healing the lame and giving sight to the blind and letting the deaf hear. And so they were there. They were there to see what Jesus might do. They were there to see what Jesus might be. But, along with those soldiers, the crowd, they weren't too committed to this guy. Oh, they would go along and make the noise. Everybody likes a parade. Everybody likes it when the crowd gets worked up and shouts hallelujah and Hosanna, and they were all praying for the Messiah to come, but did they really think Jesus was him? Not likely. He was, after all, riding on a donkey. Another group that was there were the Pharisees. Now we know about the Pharisees. They're the religious leaders. Surely they recognize Jesus for who he is, don't they? They knew the law. They had studied the Bible. They had studied the Torah, the prophets. They knew that at some point a Messiah was going to come, and no, not these guys. These Pharisees were what you called stuck-in-the-mud traditionalists. None of you would be like that. Somebody needs to look at their neighbor just to make sure. These Pharisees, they had read the law and amended the law and fixed the law so they could be in power. They were in it for the prestige. They loved walking into places and being invited to pray in their colorful robes. They loved being seated at the head table, and they loved being a part of the beauty. But this guy, Jesus, they weren't too hip on him. He kept causing trouble. He kept taking money out of their pockets. He kept stealing followers. He kept getting people to follow him instead of them. And, when they stop following one group and go to the other, the people who are losing them aren't too happy. Those Pharisees, fact is, they were angry. They were really unhappy. They were supposed to be the people's representatives to God and God's representatives to the people, but they were about keeping things the way they've always been, so that things always are good for them. I describe these first three groups as people who really had no real use for Jesus. Oh, the crowd, they liked the show, but they weren't ready to go with him. The soldiers could have cared less. The Pharisees, John tells us, looked for a way to kill him. They looked for a way to get rid of him. They looked for a way to keep what they had the way they had it. Then there's another group We talked a little bit about them at the beginning of the sermon, the disciples. They'd been with Jesus for 3 years. They'd gone everywhere with him. They had done everything he had said. Well, most everything. Well, some of the things. They'd been learning about God, and they'd been learning about service, and everything was good until he got into that fight with the Pharisees, and the Pharisees said, if you come back, we're going to kill you. And then Jesus made his announcement that he was going back to Jerusalem. It caused an uproar with the disciples. They all said, don't go, Lord, don't go. You've all heard people say that, right? Don't go. And Jesus said, I gotta go. And that's when we found out one of the real heroes of the disciples. It's a guy we never thought of being a hero, but it was Thomas. You know, the guy we call Doubting Thomas? But when Jesus said, we gotta go, Thomas then stood up and said, all right, guys, let's go to Jerusalem with him, even if it means to the death. Gotta love Thomas. He was ready to go. The fact is, Jesus knew where he was going. He knew he was headed to his death. The disciples, if they had been listening to Jesus, knew that he had been headed to his death. The Pharisees were glad he was headed to his death. They were going to help implement it. And the Romans, they just loved killing people. One more to kill? Great. Hate this place, they said. And the crowd said, we're along to see the show. It'd be good enough if these were all of the players. But there's one more group. There's one more group that appears in the 12th chapter of the Gospel of John that make this story even more important than it was without them. John tells us that there was a group of Greek men who had come to Jerusalem. And they found Philip. And they said to Philip, we want to see Jesus. So Philip takes them to Andrew, and Andrew takes them to Jesus. We don't think much about this in the story, but we all better be grateful. Because those Greek men proved once again that Jesus had come not just for the Jews, but for the Gentiles too. Jesus had come not just for one group, but for all groups. Jesus had come for not just the white folk, but the black folk, the Hispanic folk. Put whatever group in there you want. Jesus breaks down the barriers. Jesus wipes the slate clean. Because these Greek men come saying, we want to see Jesus. And the words there aren't just about seeing, but about knowing. For the crowd could see Jesus. But these men, they wanted to know him. Palm Sunday is the day that we see people choose life in the face of death. Those Greeks knew Jesus wasn't a popular guy. Oh, he was popular because of the show, but they also knew that he was not safe. the disciples, the crowd, the Roman soldiers, the Pharisees. So many in that group were ready to put him to death. But the Greeks, they wanted the life he offered. As we make this last bit of the journey, as we follow Jesus ultimately to the cross and even beyond to the resurrection, it is this day that we get to begin to choose life. For far too often, even in our world, Jesus is derided, Jesus is laughed at and about, Jesus is ignored, or Jesus has become just a show. But it's an invitation. This day says, come find life in the face of death.